Welcome, everybody. Hope you're doing well, wherever you are, despite the weather, which I'm aware is quite dark and gloomy and rainy across the country. Thank you so much for finding the time and joining us today. While we wait for more people to join, I'm going to go through the usual housekeeping. So today's session is a webinar, and for that reason, cameras and microphones are off. We also disable the chat due to the high number of people in attendance, but you can use the Q&A function throughout the whole session. So if you have any questions, feel free to post those questions in the Q&A whenever you have questions to raise. We have a vote system in place. So if someone has asked a question that you find particularly interesting, by all means, please vote for that question. And we also have an amazing team of people behind the scene who will be ready to answer any questions you might have. We're also going to look at the Q&A to identify a few questions we're going to cover at the end of the session today, where we're going to leave about 10 to 15 minutes to try to answer the best we can the questions you might put forward. So, and actually, last point, if you have any technical issues, by all means, please get in touch with us at events@jrf.org.uk. So we're just going to give it a few more seconds and then we can kick off. Right, so we have lots to cover today, and I'm very excited to be able to share with you the news that today we're officially launching our income volatility data infrastructure in partnership with Smart Data Foundry. We are going to share with you today a few useful information, but also examples of applied research and analysis that has been done using banking data. And also I'm going to provide you a bit of a backstory as to why we're here today and why we decided to work with Smart Data Foundry. So without further ado, we can kick off and on to the next slide, please. Today, you're going to be hearing from me. I'm going to be your host. For those of you who haven't met yet, I'm Rosario Piazza, Chief Insight Architect at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and I lead all things inside infrastructure. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about that in a second. But I'm also joined by an amazing team of panelists. We have Magdalena Gettler, who is Head of Research at Smart Data Foundry. She's going to tell you a bit more about the actual infrastructure that we're launching today, its components, how it works, what kind of information you can expect. And then we're going to be hearing from Mike Spencer, who is a principal research data scientist at Smart Data Foundry, who will be sharing some examples of applied research and analysis that has been done using banking data. And also we're going to hear about existing exciting research from Galina Andreeva and Todd Van Gunten and some of the ideas that people are already putting forward to explore and the potential of banking data, especially around the concept of income volatility and economic security. Next slide, please. So this is just a recap of the agenda. And as I said, there will be an opportunity for you guys to ask questions directly throughout the whole session, but particularly we're going to address those at the end. And also, in case I did not mention that this is recorded, so you can look back at the webinar in your own time, but also share with colleagues who might be interested. Next slide, please. So just very quickly about JRF and the inside infrastructure. So if you're here, chances are you're very familiar with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, but if you're not, JRF is an independent social change organization working to support and speed up the transition to a more equitable and just future, free from poverty, where people and planet can flourish. Over the last year or so, we've been quite busy developing an inside infrastructure, which, powered by quantitative and qualitative data, will act as a sat-nav, providing a series of possible routes to navigate from problem to solutions. We've been doing this in open collaborations with others. The income volatility data infrastructure is just one of the many projects that we're launching this year. But if you're thinking about what we mean by navigating from problems to solution, where we expect those routes to be identified by triangulation of different data sources, from established ones like the admin data available out there, published by ONS and the likes of the different government departments. New data, we're exploring the potential of charity data, but also experimental data products like the banking data we're here to discuss with you today. And last but not least, the lived experience of people who are going through hardship on a daily basis across the country. So this is one of the components of the Insight infrastructure, what we refer to as data and insight products, but also what we hope to generate out of that is a shared movement of people and organizations who are committed to democratizing access to better data and evidence, not just to foster innovation, but more importantly, to enable better decision-making when it comes to solving social and economic inequality in the country. But just a bit of a backstory as to why we're here today and why we're launching the income volatility data infrastructure. So there are gaps in evidence across many thematic areas, if you like, but one in particular we find particularly interesting, which is the gap in evidence on within-year earnings and income volatility in the UK. And that's why we decided to partner with the Good People, a Smart Data Foundry, because we believe that banking data has the potential to enable us to gain a better understanding of patterns in income volatility and economic security in the country across the population, but also, and you will learn more about this when Magdalena will share with you what the components of this infrastructure are. There is a possibility here to enable people to access not just new data, but near to real-time data for research and analysis purposes. You will learn soon that what we're launching is essentially made of two main components. One, which is an aggregate version of the data that can then be combined and triangulated with other data sources to enable people to grasp what's going on in the country, but also a safe haven where researchers and people who are interested in accessing the raw data will be able to, by putting forward and expressing their interest in the data, so putting forward proposals, they will be able to actually access the data itself and do their own analysis for social good. So what we hope to achieve is not just a better understanding of what's going on in the country when it comes to income volatility and economic security, but also to improve how individually and collectively we can make evidence-led decisions. But enough from me, because I'm pretty sure you're very keen to learn more about the data infrastructure we're launching today. So I'm going to pass it over to Magdalena.
Thank you for the introduction, Rosario. And let me start by introducing Smart Data Foundry. So next slide, please. Okay, so Smart Data Foundry is non-for-profit, and we're based at the University of Edinburgh. We have existed since 2020 to essentially provide secure and efficient access to private sector data for research in the public interest. We focus on providing access to de-identified financial data from trusted financial institutions. So that's our data partners. And this data you will hear sometimes is referred to as digital footprints data or smart data. And that data sits in the trusted research environment. And I will tell you a little bit more about this very shortly. Smart Data Fund received initial funding from UKRI, Strength in Places Fund, to build on the strengths in research and innovation in the central belt of Scotland. Next slide, please. As you can see, so we are mission-led, and as you can see from the image here, we occupy, I would say, a very privileged position at the intersection of public sector, private sector, and academia. And these are, as you know, three very different cultures with distinctive incentives and values. Our ambition is really to play a part in bringing advances in the research world to the government and to engage academic researchers with policymakers. As an organization, we're focusing on creating impact. And for example, our work with public sector, so we help local authorities to help them understand, for example, the effects of the government's decisions on people. So with our Insight dashboard, and my colleague Mike will tell you a little bit more about this, which is based on aggregate data, we can pinpoint areas of financial distress, and the local authority can then plan interventions to help people overcome them, and can also measure the effectiveness of different interventions. Next slide, please. Okay, so now the value of the banking data. So the story starts with a bank, so maybe I should say starts with a digital technology, which really opened a new era in our understanding of human behavior. So with people's daily activities, leaving footprints in the digital records. And it's the same with banks. Every time you interact with financial institutions, that leaves a digital trace. And until now, that data was really used by private companies to make better products, target marketing, and so on. But the potential of that banking data is enormous. To looking at the source, looking at how granular the data is, how objective it is, and really has the potential to underpin research from climate and health all the way to socioeconomic research, like with the income volatility data infrastructure that we're launching today. In addition, the data that we receive from our data partners is also updated at regular intervals, so can be weekly, monthly, depends on the relationship. But that means that as a researcher, you really can observe in near real time, how people are reacting to various events, whether it's rising inflation or the effects of certain policies. This data fits into the category of sensitive data. So that data contains personally identifiable information, PII, such as names and addresses. We receive this data in a de-identified form, of course, but this data can still be sensitive once it has been de-identified, so the PIIs are removed, particularly if there is a potential for re-identification when used with other data. So that's why it needs to be treated with utmost care, and I'll expand on this very shortly. It's worth to mention that in 2020, I'm still previous slide, yeah. So in 2020, we took part in the Information Commissioner's Office Sandbox, and as part of this, we have co-developed with them a legitimate interest assessment. So this is very much to establish our lawful basis to process the data to cover research in the public interest. So at the start of any research project, we will do a balancing assessment to really weigh up the benefits to the individual, to the society, versus the potential infringements on the data subject's rights. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we need to be very thoughtful as well as innovative with the data, guided by safe ethical frameworks. Our data is held in the trusted research environment, managed by EPCC, which is Edinburgh High Performance Computing Centre here at Edinburgh University, who are also behind the Scottish Safe Haven, and is governed by us. So we have an internal information governance team to make sure that the data is safe. For those of you who haven't come across TREs, TREs are safe, secure computing environments when you as a researcher can get access to the data in the public research. And it's always done via very rigorous approval process. So only approved researchers can access this data, and this data must be in a de-identified form. And by using TREs, basically it really helps to ensure that the data never leaves TRE. It cannot be downloaded, for example, to a researcher's own system. And there are other safeguards also put in place to help protect data. So many of you will be familiar with the ONS 5 Safes framework. So obviously we follow Safe People. So as I mentioned earlier, you need to ensure that only people who are trained in data protection, information security can access this data. So we will provide the training at Smart Data Foundry. Safe projects to ensure that data is only used for ethical, approved research, where there is a clear potential for public benefit. And also for income volatility, we need to align with JRF missions in terms of poverty and economic security. Safe settings, so I mentioned already the importance of storing this data in the TRE. That requires VPN. You'll get access to virtual machine. There is a process of multi-factor authentication. Also within the TRE, there's multiple controls in place. So for example, we cannot copy and paste data. There's no access to the internet and so forth. Safe data, so the data, as I mentioned earlier, always have to be in a de-identified form. And safe output. So anything coming in or coming out of the trusted research environment is also checked for any risk of disclosure. So that's checked by our team. So the next slide, please. Okay, so I've just covered the sort of access to sensitive data, which is really critical that we follow the safeguards. And now we can move on to the actual income volatility infrastructure, so the fun bit. So I'm really pleased to launch together with JRF the income volatility infrastructure. This is a product very closely aligned with our missions to open data for public good research. So as you can see from the image here, the access to the income volatility infrastructure is via MyFoundry, which is basically our secure portal for data assets with access for a sign-up. So you need to sign up with your organizational email. And that's where you will find the dashboard, and you can also learn more about the data behind the dashboard. So there's access to the data catalog. And there is also, you can also conduct further research with the underlying individual data that powers this dashboard, and there will be a process to be approved. As I mentioned, all the different controls. You also need to submit expression of interest, and you can explain this a little bit later. So that's me for now. So I'm going to hand over to Mike, and Mike is our head of data science, and he will tell you a little bit more about the income volatility and in particular the indicators behind it, and also talk through some examples of using banking data for research and insights. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Magdalena. I just realized I'm helpfully wearing exactly the same jumper today as I was in that photograph. As Magdalena says, I head up our research data science team here at Smart Data Foundry, and I'm going to talk through today some of the nitty-gritty on the NatWest data that we get, what we do with it, and how we make that available to you. So next slide, please. So as Magdalena says, we get NatWest data broadly each week, and this is a rough view of what it looks like. This is entirely fabricated mock data, so it doesn't internally make sense, but it gives you a rough idea of what we get. So we get some demographic information about customers, that's highlighted in green. So we get a persistent ID, so we can track the same customers throughout the broadly 5 years of our time period of data. We get a timestamp for the transaction kind of aggregation. We get the age band for the customer. We get the sex of the customer in male, female, and we also get the current postal district of the customer each week. Along with those, we also get some financial information, and these are categories designated by the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, who require all banks to do reporting, and so they cover things like broadly income and expenditure, but also broken down into whether that income comes from salary or benefits or pension, etc., and whether that expenditure is things like committed, which might be credit cards, or kind of contractual type things. It might be essential expenditure, which is sort of groceries or travel for work or school or fuel bills, and then kind of discretionary expenditure, that restaurant type spending, or uncategorized, which might be things like cash withdrawals, or all of those sorts of behavior. And we, as Magdalena said, store this individual level data within the trusted research environment, our national safe haven. Next slide. And the challenge that I suppose we have as Smart Data Foundry is transforming that individual level data into something that's meaningful, whether that's for our partners in the public sector, or whether it's for researchers who don't require access to individual level data, but just want information about an area. And so one of the examples of how we've done this is around the index of multiple deprivation. Next slide. And so we've got an example here using the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, where each dot is a postcode district in Scotland. So a postcode district is the first half of the postcode, and we have the income category from the SIMD on the x-axis, so more deprived to the right-hand side, and we have a metric of income that we've generated from NatWest data on the y-axis. And so what we can see is this convergence as areas become more deprived by the SIMD, which is in the income category is broadly those on benefits, that actually there's very little variation in terms of the different income of areas. But as you get less deprived, there are many different controls on the amount of money that people on average might earn in a postcode district. And I think this is a really good illustration of the sort of the broad wealth of information that we can get from the financial data that you don't necessarily get from purely looking at a static snapshot of the SIMD. And I think that static point is a really interesting one, that what I'm showing here is a static view for for a year or so of data, but we are getting data almost on a weekly basis, that we tend to be only 2 to 4 weeks behind the current period. And so one of the really useful things about that is that we can provide near real-time information to public sector partners. Next slide. And so this is an example of some work we've been doing with East Renfrewshire Council, who wanted to understand the cost of living impact on people who are resident within the local authority. So we can see on those two small plots up in the far right that we're presenting data there to East Renfrewshire right up to the beginning of 2024. And what we're looking at here is each dot is a data zone, or I suppose in English and Welsh parlance is an lower super output area, LSOA, and it's broadly sort of 500 to 1,000 people. And the local authority are very aware of persistent multi-generational financial hardship, but what they wanted to know about was this sort of canary in the coal mine type situation, where you have this squeezed middle who potentially have overstretched themselves in moving into a better school catchment, or maybe they've found that that poor energy efficiency of their house has meant that the rise in energy bills has made life quite unaffordable. So that's the case we can see here towards where it says results. We can see some fairly large circles, which is overdraft use, and that lines up with a high proportion of homes that have got really low energy efficiency. So the local authority have been using this to help make people aware of support that might be available. Next slide. In terms of research projects, this is some work that was led by Lynn Robertson-Rose, and it was completed on behalf of what was the Standard Life Financial Fairness Trust, but is now Aberdeen. And we were looking at the transition of people from a working life to retirement. And so we've got a few things we can pull out in this plot. I think like one of the interesting points is that as people's expenditure stabilizes in their kind of retirement, they've moved past expensive children and all of those other things. And as they get a pension, a universal basic income, we find that their overdraft use falls off dramatically. The other interesting thing here is each dot is a calendar year quarter, so a 3-month period, and we can really see the impact of the pandemic, where expenditure fell much more than income did, and that meant that people's overdraft use fell off dramatically, except in, if we look at the lowest row, the lowest income group, where we found that actually people were already living on the breadline. They couldn't reduce their expenditure anymore, so their overdraft use didn't really change. And I think this is a really powerful thing we can do with this data, is we can slice it in lots of different ways and highlight the impact on different groups of people that isn't apparent if we just treat them as a large homogeneous mass. Next slide. And so what we've been looking at as part of this project is particularly around income volatility. So this is obviously a very similar slide to the one I started with, but now rather than the information that we get from NatWest Group, these are now additional variables that we have calculated based on the ones that NatWest supplied. So a few of the things that we've been looking at, salary events are the number of times that someone, or the number of weeks I should say, that someone receives salary income over a 13-week period. And then we use that to derive things like the payment interval. And the salary CV, that stands for coefficient of variance, which is the standard deviation over the mean. Effectively, it's kind of a percentage variation in change. So if you imagine you're on a contracted monthly salary, chances are your income amount each month doesn't change very much at all. Whereas if you are a gig economy worker, or potentially like you're doing shift work or emergency overtime kind of work, that the amount of income you get from pay period to pay period varies potentially quite a lot. And so that's what that salary CV is capturing there. And we've broken that, or we've binned that into income variability, which we've split across high, medium, and low, based on some percentages of sort of less than 5% variation, or 5 to 15, or above 15 for high. We've also looked at where people get their main income source from, so whether that's salary, benefits. Again, this is back to the FCA category. And then we've averaged people's income and salary over a weekly basis. So again, if we want to make comparisons between people who are paid monthly or fortnightly or weekly, then we need to standardize that. And so we've standardized that over a weekly basis. And the final ones are Boolean, where if people are not receiving income salary, then we have just put a true false to say whether or not we would consider them unemployed. And then the same on benefits. Are they receiving benefits or not is purely based on the income benefits category there. Next slide, please. And so what we've done with this data, so what I've shown previously is available within the trusted research environment at an individual level, but we also produce aggregate versions of those data where on the demographics, either that we've calculated or derived, or the ones that are supplied by NatWest, that we are treating those as groups, and then taking things like average income or average expenditure, or those kinds of things, and then we are making those available through MyFoundry, our effectively dashboard portal. Next slide. And so some of the things we can look at kind of immediately, and this is it's certainly not in any way a deep dive, more and let's whet some appetite and generate some ideas. So if we're looking at variation in payment interval through time, I think one of the things that leaps out from this plot is the chop and change of the beginning of each calendar year. So in this case, 2022 and 2023, and the departure of people getting a regular monthly income, switching through to other, and others just kind of a catch-all to say it doesn't neatly fit into fortnightly, monthly, or weekly. And I suspect this is based on that often in December we get paid, we as a broad homogeneous mass get paid before the end of the month, and then come January we get paid again at the end of the month. And so instead of having that neat 4-week-ish period of payment, we might end up with 6 weeks or potentially even longer between pay periods. And so I think that's what we're capturing there. Next slide. And finally, I wanted to quickly look at some of the income variability. So this is that coefficient of variance. And I think there are a few things that I am quite interested to explore in this. I sort of looking particularly around areas of high variability. So particularly in sort of southern Wales, or the Outer Hebrides, or Shetland, or even to an extent the Highlands and Northeast England. And like, I wonder, is this a product of primary production type work that you have people, say, working in the steelworks in South Wales, or farming, or all of these kinds of things, where you may be doing shift work, or you're maybe doing work that is based on some kind of production cycle, and so isn't necessarily quite so fixed. And again, like, we haven't had any time to dig into this. This is there to start stimulating research questions. And so as part of that, I'd like to hand over to Kalina Andravira, who's Director of Credit Research Centre at Edinburgh University, who's started thinking about some of these questions.
Thank you, Mike. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about the research the Credit Research Centre has been already doing with a similar type of data, that is financial transactions from individual current accounts. May I have the next slide, please? You've heard more than once in today's presentation of the power this new type of digital footprint data can provide. And nevertheless, I would like to reiterate that you can get very detailed, deep, granular insights which can answer a great variety of important societal questions. And here are some examples of these questions and these insights. The first set of examples comes from a PhD project conducted by Rui Goch, supervised by myself and Dr. Cao, sponsored by EIT Digital and DirectID. There are 4 different applications or use cases that we have investigated in this project. The first one is vulnerability-related volatility. You have seen earlier the analysis of income volatility. Our research focused on cash flow or account balance volatility, so a wider picture or wider investigation. We proposed several new metrics, including coefficient of variation that you've heard already about. And what is most important, we've explored the correlation between volatility and financial vulnerability. Instances where volatility is indicative of some financial difficulties. I do not have time to go into details, but here are the links to the working paper where you can find more information. For the second application, we have explored different behavioral patterns that can signal or predict varying levels of potential distress. One of the problems with transactional data and one of the potential research questions is formally defining different levels of financial distress. There are no universally accepted definitions what is low risk and what is high risk. So in the third use case, we have experimented with latent models to provide us with data-driven labels or levels of financial distress. And we also model the transitions between these levels. Finally, the fourth use case presented a completely different problem. Here we analyzed outliers, accounts exhibiting atypical or unusual behavior, and the objective was identifying shell accounts, the accounts that are potentially used for money laundering. Next slide, please. Financial vulnerability is the recurring topic in our research. Here you can see some results from different projects together with Professor Tina Harrison and a number of other colleagues. This work was sponsored by Salad Projects Limited or Salad Money. Salad Money is a social lender that serves low-income segments of NHS and now a broader base of lower-paid public sector workers. Our interest was in understanding the level of financial health, the use and abuse of credit. And the analysis revealed quite a lot of harmful, undesirable financial behaviors. For example, as this quote from The Guardian shows, 30% of the sample we were using were borrowing quite a lot from multiple lenders, and in many instances from high-cost payday lenders. This is obviously an example where some intervention would be necessary to help these people, to prevent them from getting into more debt. Next slide, please. Finally, I would like to say a few words about our current project, work in progress, which will be using NatWest data. And this project is together with Professor Jonathan Crook, Professor Tina Harrison, and Dr. Andreas Steinhauer. This is sponsored by Edinburgh Center for Financial Innovation. You can see 4 research questions. They will be investigating the effects of macroeconomic shocks on different aspects of income and also spending. We are interested in understanding how inflation, for example, which is part of macroeconomic indicators, affects changes in income, benefits availability, but also how people adjust their spending in response to these shocks. The answers to these questions, and actually the results of all research projects that I've presented so far, have very important policy implications. In order to design effective interactions or interventions, one really needs to understand how people get into trouble, what kind of different behaviors they show, what are specific difficulties they are facing, and transactional data allow us to uncover all this. Next slide, please. I would like to hand over to Dr. Todd Van Gunten, lecturer in economic sociology.
Great, thank you, Galina, for the introduction. So I will be talking briefly about some research that we will be doing, also sponsored by the ECFI, over the next few months. Next slide, please. So as many will be aware, UK interest rates have risen quite substantially over the past few years, which has, we expect, very substantial costs, very substantial, but potentially very varied costs on households, particularly mortgage holders. So the question that we will be addressing in this research is about this impact. Specifically, we'll be asking what the impact of rising interest rates is on UK households, especially mortgage holders. So again, we expect those costs to be, those impacts to be substantial, but also highly variable. So some interesting questions in this domain include the variations of this impact across different demographic categories and geography. And then we're also interested in how different categories or other categories of household spending, such as discretionary income, respond to these rising housing costs. So do households with rising mortgage payment burdens reduce their discretionary spending in other categories? So these are, of course, I think it's clear, important questions. There are many limitations of existing data sources, such as survey data, such as limited sample size, lack of geographical identifiers, lack of panel data, and the delays in release of those data sources. Next slide, please. Conversely, there's a lot of potential of bank customer data to answer these kinds of research questions. So the NatWest customer data available courtesy of the Smart Data Foundry includes some of the key measurements that we need to answer these kinds of questions. So we have measurements of weekly spending on mortgage payments. We can also compare those spending spending in those categories to other tenure arrangements such as rent. We have geographical identifiers such as these postcode district that you've heard about earlier, and we can include some demographics such as income groups and age. So what I'll be seeking to do over the next few months is to really conduct a kind of proof of concept analysis to see if we can identify households, or more precisely, bank accounts within households that are experiencing substantial changes in housing expenditure. We'll try to filter out households that might have moved residence, looking at the period since 2022 and try to measure the magnitude of these changes. And then we will try to assess the impact of those housing cost shocks on discretionary spending in other categories. Next slide. So the Smart Data Foundry team has already done some great work on this topic and shown that you can indeed see the what is probably the impact of rising interest rates on mortgage holders. So the blue dotted line there, you see an increase in the average housing expenditure among low-income mortgage holders. You see an increase of 6% among those low-income mortgage holders compared to only 3% among higher-income mortgage holders. So that's almost twice as high. So this is really, again, sort of proof of concept, showing that we do, in fact, see these macroeconomic shocks in the NatWest customer data. Next slide. And then we also see some evidence of impact on consumer spending. So among that same group of low-income mortgage holders, we see a smaller rise in discretionary spending, which may be attributable to increasing housing costs. So these past two slides are really very much looking at the average. And so what we're looking to do in the research that'll be leading over the next few months is really unpack those trends into much finer grained demographic groups and across geography, as mentioned. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. I would just like to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers, because I think they managed to do pretty well in providing you a bit of a flavor of what kind of analysis has been done, the kind of data that you can expect, but also how banking data could be potentially applied to look into different areas, whether it's housing, people accessing loans, but also monitoring over time what's going on at local, but also potentially regional and national level. So just as a recap, if you want to find out more, Everplay with the data infrastructure that Smart Data Foundry has set up as part of this partnership, you can do so by accessing relevant information on the JRF website, also the Smart Data Foundry website. And there's a link here which you can use to register and gain access to the portal. This is free of charge. You only need to provide basic information and you will jump straight into the tool. You will find there lots of useful information, not just the dashboard itself, the data and all of that, but and the data catalog. So providing you a list with the information that is actually included there, but also the code of conduct. I think it's important to emphasize that we, and by we I mean mostly Smart Data Foundry, have put in place a robust system of safeguarding to ensure that the data is safe and secure to use, and that doesn't cause any harm to the people the data refers to in the first place. But as mentioned, there will be also an opportunity for researchers, analysts who might be interested in accessing the raw data set, so the underlying data set, to put forward an expressions of interest, which will be jointly reviewed by the Inside Infrastructure team at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, but also the Smart Data Foundry team behind the infrastructure. I'm aware that we put a lot of emphasis on income volatility and economic security, but we are really keen and open to hear whatever suggestions and ideas and research questions you might come up with. So we strongly encourage you to take the time and put forward those ideas, because we're very keen to review them. And it's probably important to mention that as part of this partnership, we are making around 20 licenses, so access to the raw data sets, in other words, available for free for people who are submitting those proposals. So we're very keen to hear from you. What do you think about the tool? What your user experience is, but also what ideas you might want to put forward to explore further and the potential of banking data. So this is the end of the session, but now on to more exciting things. We're really keen to hear from you, and I can see that lots of people have been particularly active in the Q&A. So I tried my best to summarize a few questions which felt quite similar, but also those that have been receiving the highest number of votes. So I'm gonna pose the first question to the panel, which is probably, well, it is a really important one, but it's how limited, what are the limitations and potential bias that comes with this data set? So some of our attendees have mentioned that, of course, we're looking just a proportion of data. It's NatWest customers. There's a risk for those who are digitally excluded. And we know that there is plenty of evidence that usually those are the individuals who live in very deprived areas of the country, don't have access to the same technology that others might have to. So what are some of the limitations and risks revolving around the data? And I'm really happy for any of you to step in. No one wants to take that question. Okay, I'm going to abuse my power and I'm going to ask that question to the guys at Smart Data Country. Magdalena or Mike, would you like to take that one?
I think maybe Mike, you start, and I can complement.
Absolutely. Sorry, I was fiercely answering a question in the chat. Can you just
Same
do a
here.
quick, so it was possibly just the same question you were asking, just Rosario. So was this about representativeness?
Yes, exactly. What are
Or
the
the,
limitations
like,
that comes
effectively,
with
like the kind of the missing piece of. So, so I guess it came up in a few of the questions I answered in the chat. So in terms of what we currently have, we've got 1.2 million NatWest customers. That's what's the plots and everything you've seen today, that's based on that. Since November last year, we've started receiving 5 million customers, which is around about half of their client base. And they're randomly sampled from NatWest Group's entire customer base. So broadly comparing that to population, it's just under 10% of the UK population. There are some areas where we have better coverage and some areas where we have poorer coverage, and these are largely based on kind of historic banking trends. So NatWest own Royal Bank of Scotland. So in terms of some of the Western Isles, like Colin Tyree, or the southern end of the Outer Hebrides, we've got over 60% of the island population coverage in those places, whereas places like northeast England or the Midlands, which were dominated by different banking groups, then we're a little bit less there, and we're maybe looking at kind of somewhere between 6 and 8% of the population based on the census. We've looked at some things around benefit categories. The work that Todd showed that Nathan had done on mortgages and things like that. We've also looked at rent. We have very poor rent coverage for all the reasons you could imagine, that that I'm sure we have a good sample of people paying rent, but identifying someone who's paying rent is, I suspect, notoriously difficult, because that probably just appears as a person to person or a person to business, and unless it specifically says letting agent or landlord in that transaction, like it will be almost impossible to pick that out. From a mortgage perspective, we are very close to the UK average of, I think it's around about 14 or 15% of mortgages. So that kind of thing's very good. Longer term, as in over the next few months, we're working on a research paper or a data paper describing how representative the data set is, and I hope to make that preprint or a preprint of that available, sort of at some point this year. But there's lots of ways we can potentially look at that. There was a question on, and I guess like the known unknowns, those people who live cash in hand and everything else. And I think it's, this kind of, I mean, you could never answer that with banking data, but then that's I suppose a different research question. That what we have banking data, so we can answer research questions on banking data, but we do not have, no, maybe I should change that. My team does not have access to information on the unbanked. We do have a second data science team that develops synthetic data, and they are able to simulate cash exchanges with people. So if it was a case of wanting to run experiments on how that sector of society behaves, then that is something we can do as an organization, but it is not part of this project.
Fantastic.
I can
Magdalena?
I can just add that we are also in advanced discussions with other banks across the UK, so the representativeness will increase the more data we have from other banks. So this is this looks quite promising at this stage. There was a question about lived experience I saw as well here.
I'm happy to take that one as well, but
Okay.
please, by all means, go if you have something to say on that.
No, that's okay. I can wait. I wonder whether there is anything maybe from Galina you can tell, because you've been doing research of salad money, and how have you responded to the representativeness question?
I think the advantage of NatWest data is almost complete coverage of the UK population, just due to the broad range of their customer base. And also I would like to emphasize the fact that this is current account data. Nowadays, almost everyone will have current account, a debit card. So the missing population, the missing segments of the population are minimal. So in terms of, if you are interested in the research in some kind of general trends of the UK population, these data can be taken as representative. If you are interested in niche segments like digitally excluded populations, I think that maybe you need to look at different methods of data collection and kind of triangulate banking data with surveys or other means of reaching these very difficult to research segments of population. So the salad money that I mentioned in our research has the advantage of targeting specifically people on low incomes. So in a way, this data is more representative of a specific segment, but also it's not ideal because it's missing the general picture that NatWest data can provide. So from my experience, any data has its advantages and limitations. There isn't really something absolutely perfect and ideal. You just have to work around it. And think of potential biases these limitations can bring, and how methodologically you can address them.
That's a really useful point. Thanks for that. I think it's important to remind that we are at the beginning of something new. So I know that, Mike and Magdalena mentioned that they are already in conversation with other banking institutions. So in launching this new initiative, what we hope is not just to enable people to access more and better data and potentially come up with questions that we are currently not thinking about. But also we hope that this will bring more institutions to join this kind of initiatives for a good cause. So the way we describe this is a bit of a prototype, a bit of an experiment, even though it's quite advanced in terms of kind of development and the tools and the underlying data. But really, this is the beginning of a journey that for which we can possibly anticipate every single step. So we hope that this kind of initiatives will do more social good. There will be things that we'll learn about, things that we don't know yet, things that we will need to take into account. But this is why we are very keen for many of you to join us on this journey, because it's important that you, users, people who are potentially interested in this kind of data, can apply this data for social good, can share with us and teach us also to an extent the things that we don't know. As I said, we don't have all the answers. This is just the beginning of something new, with all the limitations that we are aware affect the data. but also there's plenty of statistical methodology there. You can triangulate this data with other things. You don't need to treat this in isolation. You're not going to find all the answers you're looking for here, but it's a good starting point to trial something new that has never been done before, really. And very quickly before, I had a question for Todd, but very quickly before I do that, I wanted to say something about the lived experience. So I talk about the inside infrastructure and this particular partnership being one of the many components of the pillars underlying the inside infrastructure that we are developing at JRF. We are currently running 3 main projects that are entirely focused on people with lived experience. One is called Grounded Voices, which is a new project that we are running in-house. We are in constant dialogue with small groups of people with direct experience of poverty, social and economic injustice around the country. So we are gaining daily, weekly insights from those people who can then apply it and use almost as a lens to look through the banking data project, but other projects that we're doing as well. We are running for a whole year a social media listening project, so data scraping from 3 main forums and social media platforms out there to see what is the people are sharing about their actual experience. Is there anything that are we missing? Is there anything that we can use and apply to banking data projects and other projects to explore areas that we normally do not consider? And then last but not least, we are very lucky at JRF because over the last 5 years or so, we've been working with a GPAG, which stands for the Grassroots Poverty Action Group. Is a fantastic bunch of people who are spread across the country who've been supporting JRF, not just by providing and sharing their own story, but also sense checking that the kind of research questions, the policy recommendation we might come up with are respectful, proportionate, and in line with what is their day-to-day experience of hardship and inequality. So we're doing our best to put in place the systems to make sure that we move away from that extractive process, the ivory tower process, where we think we have the best solutions possible without listening in the first place to the people who have direct experience of things that we don't necessarily know because we're not in their shoes. I'm going to stop there. Of course, if you want to learn more about those, you can always check the JRF and the Inside Infrastructure website. So the question I had for Todd, given the examples you shared with us, looking at the data, did you come across have you ever faced the need of understanding what is the household composition, thinking about specifically those who might have dependent children and of course the kind of cost and housing related costs that might go through? Or do you think this might be one of the current limitations of the data set?
Yeah, thanks. So first, I should emphasize that the slides that I showed were research done by Nathan Bourne as part of the Smart Data Foundry team. And so we're really, I'm getting started right now with really building on the work that he's already done. As far as I know, and maybe Mike or Magdalena can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we know anything about dependent children within these data, unless we could infer that maybe from categories of expenditure, but that seems quite difficult. So that is, I would think, one of the limitations of this data set, and as has been said, we can't do everything with it, but there are many things that we can do that we couldn't do with other data sources.
I can quickly jump in on dependence. If an account holder is not receiving any other kind of benefit, and we can identify child benefit recipients, and they're very specific amounts, so you can identify how many children are involved. I guess what I would say is those who are most in need are unlikely to be receiving only child benefit. They may well be receiving other kinds of benefits as well, which is going to mask the signal. We have been in long discussion with NatWest on getting extra category data, and we hope, but I am not making any promises, that this might start arriving with us next month. One of those data categories is child benefit in a separated from benefits. So that should hopefully give us a lot more detail. However, and understandably, NatWest are nervous about children, child protection, all of those other kinds of things, and so that is not a variable that will be made available for general use. It will sit in a protected space effectively that will be made available on a project by project basis based on NatWest sign off in order to protect children and all those other things. It's these data are NatWest is responsible to their customers primarily, and so there are all sorts of safeguards in place around that. So yes, there is potential things we can do, but at the moment it's watch this space.
And on that note,
I was going to say that there are some things that you can infer from the data, but that will be your prediction, not necessarily the hard information. So looking at the benefits categories is one way to probably try to infer families with children, but also looking at the level of income. If someone is interested in single parent families, again, this is sensitive information, so you can expect NatWest to provide something like this. But maybe you can look at the level of income, and from this you may make some limited judgment whether it is likely to come from one source of income, or one person, or maybe two earners.
Thanks, Galina. I'm afraid time's up. I know there, I'm just very grateful to all of you guys for, taking the time and sharing a bit of a preview into things to come. I will encourage everyone who's been attending. First of all, thank you so much for your time. We will be circulating an email with all the details, the link to the recording, so you can watch it back and share. But more importantly, don't be a stranger, get in touch. If you have any questions, then we will do also our best to answer some of those questions offline, because they're still coming. So that's fantastic. I'm just really grateful for each and every one of you for taking the time being with us today, and for joining us at the beginning of what is potentially a very exciting journey. So watch this space, don't be a stranger. Thanks again for taking the time. Wish you all the best. Bye now.